Subscribe to Dr. Nightmare Channel now.
Story 1. The Hollow Deep. The first snow of the season always brought a strange silence to Hollow Deep Forest. It wasn't just the dampening effect of the snow on sound. It was something heavier, almost oppressive. The air seemed to thicken. The trees leaned in on themselves, and every shadow lingered longer than it should. I had lived in the area for nearly 15 years, and had walked those woods more times than I could count. I thought I knew them. But last winter proved me wrong. I had moved into a small cedar cabin at the farthest edge of the county, a half-mile from the last gravel road with nothing but pines and frozen streams for company. I worked remotely, wrote in the evenings, and hunted occasionally. Solitude wasn't just something I tolerated, it was something I craved. So when the first snow hit in late November, I was almost giddy. The world would quiet down, and I could sink into the kind of peace you only find when no one is within shouting distance. The first strange thing happened 2 mornings after the snow. I stepped out onto my porch with a steaming mug of coffee and noticed something in the yard. Tracks. Not deer tracks, not rabbit, not coyote. Human. Barefoot. A single set, crisp and deep in the powder, cutting straight across my property. They came from the tree line, passed within a few feet of my porch steps, and disappeared back into the forest in a perfectly straight line. I stared at them for a long time, the coffee cooling in my hands. The snow was fresh. Whoever had left those prints had done it sometime in the night. And barefoot? The nearest neighbor was miles away, and no one sane would wander barefoot through snow in the middle of nowhere. I followed them for a short distance, but they vanished into a thick wall of evergreens that swallowed all light. Something in me, an instinct I didn't yet understand, told me not to go further. That night, I triple-checked the locks on my doors and windows. The forest was a black wall beyond my windows, and every time the wind shifted, I thought I saw movement between the trees. When I finally slept, my dreams were cold and colorless, full of pale figures standing just beyond reach. 3 nights later, the footprints came back. This time there were 2 sets. One still barefoot, the other, I'm not even sure how to describe it. The prints were larger than my own boot, but the toes seemed elongated, almost clawed. They didn't match any animal I knew. Both sets moved in that same unsettling straight line, passing close to my cabin, then back into the woods. It was as if they were pacing me, circling without getting closer. I sat awake until dawn with my rifle across my lap, every muscle rigid. At one point I heard it, slow, deliberate crunching in the snow, moving just beyond the tree line. Not rushing, not trying to hide, just circling. I wanted to throw open the door and shout into the dark, but my throat felt like it was full of ice. Eventually the sound faded, but I didn't move until daylight came. For 2 weeks, nothing else happened. I convinced myself it had just been some lost hiker, maybe even a prank from some insane drifter passing through. But the forest didn't let me hold on to that lie for long. It was mid-December when I decided to cut a trail through the snow toward an old trapping shed I kept about a quarter-mile out. The shed was in a clearing, where the trees broke just enough to let in pale winter light. When I arrived, the door was ajar. Inside, the air was colder than outside, and every tool I owned had been moved. Not taken, just rearranged in strange, deliberate patterns. A saw lay neatly across a shovel handle, a length of rope coiled perfectly inside a rusted bucket, and in the center of the shed floor, a small mound of snow. On top of that snow was something I will never forget. It was a dead crow, wings spread unnaturally wide, eyes missing, beak split down the center. Around its body, someone had pressed those same elongated claw-like footprints into the snow, forming a perfect circle. I left without touching anything. When I reached my cabin, I shut every curtain, bolted the door, and kept the lights off. That night, I didn't sleep. In the days that followed, the forest changed. The usual creak of branches in the wind became whispers in a language I didn't understand. Shadows gathered where they shouldn't, and more than once I swore I saw movement through the narrow gaps in the curtains, tall, thin shapes lingering in the snow. The footprints appeared 3 more times, always circling, always moving in that same straight line past my cabin. On Christmas Eve, I woke to a knock at my door. It was soft, rhythmic. 3 taps, pause, 3 more taps. I stayed still, listening. The knock came again. Then the sound of something dragging across the porch. When I finally looked through the peephole, the porch was empty. But the snow beyond was covered in hundreds of overlapping footprints, both human and clawed, spreading outward in a perfect spiral. I called the sheriff the next morning, but he didn't bother coming out. He said I'd probably been visited by trespassers or kids messing around. When I tried to explain the prints, he cut me off and told me to stay inside at night. That was over a month ago. Now, it's late January and the snow is falling again. I'm writing this with my rifle within arm's reach, the curtains drawn tight. About an hour ago, I saw them. 2 tall figures standing at the edge of the trees, motionless, their faces obscured by shadow. They didn't move, didn't step closer, just stood there until the snow thickened enough to hide them. I don't know what they want. I don't know how long they've been here. But I know this: the forest around my cabin isn't mine anymore. It belongs to them. And every time I close my eyes, I feel the cold bite of snow on bare feet, moving in a straight line towards my door.
Story 2: The Watcher's Trail. The northern wilderness is a place that swallows people whole. I don't mean that as a metaphor. Every year, hikers and hunters vanish without a trace, their names whispered in local bars for a few weeks before fading into the background noise of other disappearances. It's not like the search parties don't try. But out here, the trees are older than memory, and the ground has a way of covering its secrets quickly. Last October, I set out for a week-long solo trek along an unmarked section of forest known locally as Red Hollow. The name had nothing to do with the foliage. It came from a legend about a vanished logging camp where men supposedly went mad and tore each other apart, standing the ground dark for decades. Most people dismissed the story as campfire fiction, but I'd grown up hearing it and wanted to see the place for myself. Besides, I had been hiking solo for years. I knew how to handle myself in the woods. The first 2 days were perfect. Crisp air, amber light filtering through the thinning canopy, the sound of dry leaves crunching underfoot. I kept my pace steady, stopping only to make camp well before nightfall. Out here, you didn't wander after dark unless you wanted trouble. It was on the 3rd night that I noticed the footprints. I was a good mile off any marked trail, camped beside a shallow stream. The prints were fresh, pressed into the damp earth just across the water. They were boot prints, size maybe 11 or 12, moving parallel to my camp before curving toward the trees. At first, I assumed they were mine from earlier, but the stride was longer, the tread unfamiliar. And there was only one set. no return prints. I tried to shake it off. The woods aren't private property. Anyone could be passing through. Still, I kept the fire low that night and slept lightly, my hand near my knife. The next day, the trail seemed different. I had memorized my route, but the landmarks had shifted. A boulder I'd passed earlier was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out log. A cluster of birch trees I had marked in my notes now stood farther apart. It was like the forest itself had rearranged while I slept. By mid-afternoon, I came across something that made me stop cold. Another set of footprints, this time in the middle of the narrow game trail I had been following. Same size, same tread, and they were pointed directly toward me. I scanned the trees, listening. The forest was utterly still. No birds, no wind, nothing. I don't scare easy, but there's a certain kind of silence that gets under your skin, the kind that feels like it's waiting for you to make the first move. I pressed on, moving faster than I normally would. Every so often I glanced behind me, but the trail stayed empty. Still, the feeling of being watched never left. That night I camped in a ravine, hoping the steep slopes would block anyone from approaching unseen. I built no fire, ate cold rations, and stayed awake listening to the dark. It must have been past midnight when I heard the first sound. A slow, deliberate crunch of leaves above the ravine. Then another, and another. They moved along the ridgeline, pausing every few steps. Whoever it was didn't call out or use a light. I gripped my rifle and waited, heart pounding. The sound stopped after a while, but I didn't sleep. By morning, I found new footprints circling the perimeter of my camp. They never came closer than 20 feet, but they traced the shape of the ravine perfectly, as if the person had been mapping my location. I decided then to cut my trip short and head south toward the nearest access road. It would still take me 3 days to get out, but the longer I stayed, the worse this would get. On the second day of my retreat, I noticed something else. The prints were no longer behind me. They were ahead. Whoever was following me had somehow gotten in front without crossing my path, and now the prints weren't alone. A second set, smaller, almost childlike, ran alongside them. The smaller ones moved erratically, sometimes veering off the trail before coming back. The air felt wrong, heavy, damp, and close, even though the sky was clear. I kept my rifle ready, finger resting lightly against the trigger guard. By the time I made camp that evening, I was a wreck. I picked a spot in a dense thicket, almost impossible to see from the trail, and sat with my back to a tree. As darkness fell, I began to hear faint tapping sounds. 2 quick knocks, pause, 3 slower ones. They seemed to move around me, sometimes close, sometimes far. Once I thought I saw a pale face between the branches, but when I aimed my light, there was nothing there. I didn't remember falling asleep, but I woke to the sound of breathing. It was close. Too close. Just beyond the flap of my tent. Slow, steady, human. Then, as quietly as it came, it receded into the trees. At dawn, I found no footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. But my pack had been unzipped. and inside, all of my food was gone. In its place was a small bundle wrapped in animal hide. I opened it with shaking hands. Inside were 3 teeth. Human. Yellowed and worn smooth at the edges. I didn't waste a second packing up. I hiked harder than I ever had in my life, muscles screaming, lungs burning. The trail blurred into a haze of motion, but sometime after noon, I froze. Up ahead, in the middle of the trail, stood a figure. Tall, thin, dressed in ragged clothing that hung loose over its frame. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and in one pale hand it held my stolen food. Beside it, half hidden behind its leg, was something smaller. A child, I thought at first, until it stepped into the light. Its face wasn't right. The skin was stretched too tight, the eyes too large, and when it opened its mouth, I saw nothing but blackness inside. I raised my rifle, but before I could aim, both figures stepped backward into the trees and were gone. Not a sound, not a trace. Just the empty trail ahead of me. I didn't stop moving until I reached the access road the next day. A passing truck took me to town where I told the sheriff a version of the story that left out the impossible parts. He listened without much interest and told me to stay off unmarked trails. That was 6 months ago. I haven't been back to Red Hollow, but 2 weeks ago, I found something in my mailbox. No note, no envelope. Just a small bundle wrapped in animal hide. Inside were 4 more teeth.
Story 3: The Frozen Ascent. There's a part of the Whitefall Range that doesn't appear on most maps. It's not that it's secret, just so remote and inhospitable that almost no one bothers going there. The ridges are jagged, the weather turns without warning, and the valleys below are filled with shadow even in midday. Locals call it the Silent Spine, a stretch of mountains said to be cursed since before there were names for the land. I didn't believe in curses. I was a winter mountaineer, not a storyteller. I'd summited frozen peaks in Alaska, Norway, the Andes. The Silent Spine, I told myself, was just another challenge. A week in the backcountry, a solo climb, and then home with bragging rights. The first 3 days went exactly as planned. I followed the frozen river north until the valley narrowed, then began my ascent toward the ridgeline. The air was sharp and dry, the snow hard-packed under my boots. Each night I dug a small snow cave for shelter, cooked a hot meal on my stove, and slept without trouble. It was the 4th morning when things shifted. I woke before sunrise to an odd sound, a faint, rhythmic creaking from somewhere outside. I thought it might be the wind in the ice, but when I crawled from my cave, the air was still. The sound stopped.
I shook it off and continued the climb, but not an hour later, I saw the first sign that something was wrong. A line of footprints, half filled with drifted snow, cutting across the slope from left to right. They weren't mine. The gait was wrong, the stride too long, and most unsettling of all, they were barefoot. It was negative 15 degrees. No sane person would be walking barefoot here. But the prints were fresh enough that the edges hadn't softened completely. They led toward a narrow chute in the rock wall, a place I'd planned to pass the next day. That night, the wind came up hard, howling across the ridge like a living thing. I anchored my tent in the lee of a boulder and pulled my bag tight around me, but sleep was impossible. Every so often, the wind would dip and I'd hear it again, that same creaking, like wood under strain, steady and deliberate. Sometime after midnight, I opened my eyes and saw a shadow against the tent wall. It wasn't moving with the wind. It was perfectly still. I grabbed my ice axe and unzipped the flap in one quick motion. There was nothing there. Only the snow, glittering under the moonlight, and a single set of footprints leading away from my camp. Barefoot. The next morning, I considered turning back, but the climb had me in its grip. Summit fever, they call it. The inability to quit even when you should. I told myself I'd go one more day, then reassess. By late afternoon, I reached the chute I'd seen from below. It was narrower than I had expected, a twisting corridor of ice and stone. Halfway up, I noticed something embedded in the ice wall. A piece of fabric, sun-bleached and frayed. I chipped it free with the pick of my axe and held it up. It was the sleeve of a jacket. Inside the torn lining was something small and rigid. A finger bone. I dropped it without thinking, my stomach churning. From deeper in the chute, the creaking sound started again. Slow, deliberate, in perfect rhythm. I backed down, heart racing, and made camp farther down the slope. That night, the temperature plummeted. I wrapped myself in every layer I had, but still shivered violently. At some point, exhaustion won, and I fell into a fitful sleep. When I woke, my tent was gone. I was lying in the open, snow swirling around me, gear scattered. The footprints were back, dozens of them, encircling where I had slept. Some were human, some were not. The shapes were wrong, the toes splayed and clawed, the depth too deep for the size. I gathered what I could and forced myself downhill. The weather turned, a wall of white swallowing everything. I could barely see 5 feet ahead. But through the blur of snow, I kept catching glimpses. A figure just at the edge of sight, tall and thin, pacing me. Once I thought I saw 2. They never approached, never retreated, just stayed level with me no matter how fast or slow I moved. By the time I reached the tree line, my compass needle was spinning uselessly. I was lost. The storm was everywhere, the world reduced to noise and whiteness. I don't know how long I wandered before the trees broke into a clearing. In the center stood a crude shelter, built of stacked stone and snow, barely high enough to crouch inside. The footprints led directly to it.
Every instinct screamed at me to keep moving, but the cold was killing me. I ducked inside, finding it empty except for a fire pit made of blackened stones. On the far wall, carved deep into the ice, were dozens of tally marks, and above them, in jagged letters, a single word: stay. I lasted one night inside. The creaking never stopped. Sometimes it was outside the shelter, sometimes it was inside, though I could see nothing. At dawn, I ran. I don't remember the descent. I only know that I woke up 2 days later in a ranger station, half frozen, with no memory of how I got there. The rangers told me they'd found me at the edge of the valley, stumbling in circles. When they asked where my gear was, I couldn't answer. It's been 3 months since I left the Silent Spine. I still hear the creaking sometimes, late at night when the wind is still. And 2 days ago, I found something at my doorstep. A piece of fabric, sun-bleached, frayed, the sleeve of my jacket.